Okay, so we talked about Hull House and settlement houses briefly yesterday. We said one of the first big reform movements that kind of starts in the 1890s is the creation of settlement houses, which were basically these community centers to try to help out low-income areas. A lot of times they would either have a building placed or they would find an abandoned building in a low-income area, like you see with Hull House here in Chicago, and they would use it as a community center, offering several different types of services to help poor in those areas. That could include, language services, job skill services, daycare, like you see here, providing hot meals or maybe temporary housing until you find a place to stay. So basically, all of the things that settlement houses are providing are just basic things that lower income folks might need in these poverty-stricken areas, but they're funded by what? Private, not companies, but private donations, right? So they're being run by what kind of people? Middle class. So middle class people, not the government, not the ultra rich, middle class people who are developing a conscience about how people are being treated in society, begin to try to take reform into their own hands. And so they create things like settlement houses to try to help better their fellow man in these cities. So the only example you need to know for U.S. history for this is Hull House in Chicago, made by Jane Addams. So this is Jane Addams right here. This is a picture of Hull House, a picture of the inside of Hull House. But it's like it's just like Tammany Hall was for political machines. It's the only example you need to be aware of for settlement houses. But she's a reformer. She's involved in a lot of stuff. Like she was involved in some women's rights stuff. She was involved in fighting for labor laws, labor changes too. But her biggest claim to fame is making this organization called. Yes. Sure. Her biggest contribution is development of Hull House in the 1890s. Everybody's good on that? So that's kind of recapping from yesterday. I know we got cut off with that, but is everybody good? No problems? Okay. So that's kind of old. Moving on to the new. All right. One more thing to say about this is that basically this is the foundation for the future of social workers. Like Hull House and Hull House workers are like the foundation of social workers. Is this nice marker? So this is like laying the foundation for the future of social workers in the United States. And many of these people were also advocates for things like child labor laws, housing reform, women's rights. They also, like Adams and others in these groups, will fight for other reform movements too, like child labor laws, housing reform, and women's rights. All right, one of the movements that's inspiring people to make change in this time period is called the social gospel movement. So the social gospel movement is this religious movement that takes place like in the 80s and 90s in cities. Mostly done by Protestant clergy. So the social gospel movement is mostly a Protestant church movement in the cities. So it's mainly a Protestant church movement in the cities. Essentially what the social gospel movement is, it's applying Christian principles to help in society. Because what's the message of Jesus in the Bible in terms of people? Right, that Jesus himself helped the poor, was with the poor. So essentially it's just taking basic Christian principles and saying that you have a responsibility to go out and help your fellow man. You can't just do nothing. So a lot of these urban Protestants felt compelled with the social gospel movement to go out and try to do things or help do things to make people living in poverty better. One of which is what? Create what? Settlement houses, right? So I would have that down, that the social gospel movement definitely influences settlement houses, because that's where the social conscience comes from, right? So on that note, because I've seen questions like this before, is the social gospel movement about religion? No, it's about what? Helping society, right? Improving society. So if that question were to come up on a test, don't think this is like a religious reform movement. That's not really what's happening. It's inspired by religion, but it's trying to basically make society better, right? That's the purpose of the social gospel movement, not religious reform or something. So a lot of middle-class Protestants were influenced by this to try to solve social problems. All right, moving on to religion and society. So kind of a religion update at this point. So all religions felt challenges to adapt to modern workforce. Like a lot of the religions felt a lot of challenges to adapt to the modern workforce. Because essentially, the way people behave and act and how they're living now are a lot different than they were back before cities were industrialized. And so it's kind of one of those things like how much should the church be involved with improving people or helping people out? Catholics gained influence in this time period, mainly thanks to what? Well, just immigration, right? Lots of Irish, lots of Italians coming here. So there's a large Catholic increase in this time period. A lot of times because of that reason, because so many immigrants were Catholic and were typically working class people, the Catholic Church a lot of times became identified with supporting what group within the working class, or groups? Unions, right? So a lot of the Catholic churches were very supportive of unions in this time period as well. One religious organization that's going to be borrowed from England is the Salvation Army. So they're going to borrow the Salvation Army concept from England and bring it here to America, which obviously we still have. But what's the overall purpose of the Salvation Army?
Give what you don't give so other people.
Well, you make donations and they can take that and give to people. But a lot of times, Salvation Army will give stuff away for free to people who need it. They might provide like meals and those kind of things too, clothing for people. So this charity organization that has religious inspiration, hence the name like Salvation Army, that's an idea that comes from England, but we adapt it in like the 1880s and 90s to help bring basic needs for homeless people and poor. But because it's religious, they also preach to them as well and share Christian principles. As far as denominations or new ideas go, there's only really one that kind of develops in the late 1800s, and that's going to be Christian Science, developed by this lady named Mary Baker Eddy. This is not Scientology. Scientology is something totally different. So Christian Science essentially still falls within Christianity. Scientology is something totally different. So don't confuse the two ideas. So Mary Baker Eddy influenced a lot of urban middle class people with her idea of good health was the result of correct thinking about Father, Mother, God. So she was influential to a lot of urban middle class people who taught that good health was the result of correct thinking about Father, Mother, God. Basically believing that God is not a he or she. God is God. So God has what kind of qualities? Sure, best of male and female, right? God, because forever in the Bible, it's always he this or he that. So it's basically saying that God is not a gender, right? God has different qualities. What? Look confused. Or like the correct thinking about way religion works and everything else will lead you being rewarded with good health. And so this is also a time period where there's a lot of, modernization, industrialization, Darwinism's out now. So when it's Christian Science, basically they're Christians with being okay adapting what concepts into their religion. Or just newer scientific approaches, right? That they're not going to shun scientific advancements or ideas, that they're okay incorporating scientific developments of that time period. All right, families and women. So urban life changed families because parents and children were isolated from extended families. So urban life changed families because parents and children were now isolated from extended families. Especially a lot of these immigrants who come here and are on their own now in America. So many families, whether they were American-born or foreign-born, are just living with parents and children. That's it. Not necessarily nearby extended family. Divorce rates rose to 1 out of 12 by 1900. Mostly because states began to relax their laws on marriage. So by 1900, many states began to relax their laws on marriage, making it easier to divorce or have reasons to divorce. Because the sad thing is, for a long time in America and in Europe, you had to have some really good reasons to divorce your husband or wife. Because if you couldn't prove whatever it is you're trying to do, you couldn't just divorce. Like today, if you want to get divorced, you can just go get divorced. You don't have to have like reasons or proof. But back then, you would have to have like some kind of way to demonstrate a need for divorce. Well, they start to relax those things, so divorce rates go up. And you might say, well, it's bad, people are getting divorced more. But it's also like, what if you're in an abusive relationship and legally you couldn't divorce your husband before these laws change? And that's what we're looking at too. People who don't need to be together are getting separated, yes.
Wasn't there also like, well, maybe not, but like arranged marriages and stuff where people...
Not really anymore by this point. I mean, that was kind of more earlier, but not really by this time. Family size reduced too. That's also a natural change with living in cities. If you're living in a city, every kid you have is a what? Another mouth to feed. So you're only going to have like 1 or 2 kids now. So that's a big change. Moving from rural areas to urban areas, which we've been talking about, the amount of children being born to families are dramatically reducing too. Because you would have 8 kids when you live on a farm, because why? More free labor, right? It's awesome. And you have plenty of places to like let them roam around and whatever. But in the city, not so much. The women's movement also resumes this time period too. So after Civil War, who's your new champion for women's rights or women's suffrage? Susan B. Anthony, right? So Susan B. Anthony, this is her. This is earlier Susan B. Anthony. She was actually involved pre-Civil War, but she doesn't become who she becomes until post-Civil War. So Susan B. Anthony is going to be this big champion of women's rights and as well as women's right to vote, suffrage, after Civil War. From like 1869 until her death in like 1905, 1906, she goes to Congress every single year and gives a speech about the need for women's suffrage. So she is fighting that fight, and now that the Civil War is over and all those issues are done, these reform issues like temperance and women's rights resurge again. So that's one of her big pushes is fighting for women's suffrage. Stanton is still around. We talked about Stanton with the Seneca Falls Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is still around, and she and her work together. They form an organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association post-Civil War. So after Civil War, Anthony and Stanton's old at this point, so she's going to die fairly soon. They make NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So Susan B. Anthony becomes the president of NASA, and she'll be that until 1900, trying to fight for women's suffrage. They had a 3-part strategy under Anthony. One is you try to get states to change their laws to provide suffrage, because every state can decide who votes, unless there's a federal law that says you have to let these people vote. So at that time, you could have a state decide women could vote, even if other ones didn't. The first state, even though at that time was a territory, the first state to allow women the right to vote was what state? First of all, back up. What region of the country do you think is going to be the most open to women's suffrage at this time? Out west. Why?
Because they've all been like working.
Yeah, living out there, everybody's a little bit more equal because they're all struggling together, right? So what state out west? Wyoming. 1869, Wyoming was the first state to let women's suffrage happen. And then like the next, there'll be like 3 or 4 more before 1900, but they're all where? They're all west, right? They're all western states. I wasn't literally pointing the direction. Actually, that is west, so yeah. So, but yeah, west. Maybe I instinctively did that. I mean, it's like, yeah, passive movements. Anyway, that was one strategy, was to get states to do it. Second strategy was to try to get courts to challenge the 14th Amendment in various situations or cases. So like they basically try to bring the 14th Amendment as many times to different courts as possible, because under the 14th Amendment it says that everybody's equally protected before the law, right? So women were pissed off about the 15th Amendment because it only gave the right to vote technically to who? Just males, or just males in general, right? It didn't address women at all, so they were upset about that. So they try to challenge the 14th, which talks about equality before the law, and try to get the courts to take this issue up, which they weren't that successful at doing, but they're trying to make this go to the Supreme Court and make it addressed nationally. The third goal, the third objective, was obviously to create a national amendment. So the third one was to create their own national amendment, which will happen later on, but after Anthony dies. Another change, too, is that more women can now own and control property. So better divorce rates now. Women can control and own property better. Fewer children being born. All those things are changing. And the women's suffrage movement has resurged by the 70s in this time period. So